All right, so let's get started here. Sorry about the slight delay here, folks, but we are ready to go. So thank you so much for joining us today for Ministry in a Global Health Pandemic with Joshua Rodriguez-Hobbs. Just a quick couple of tech notes. If you do have any questions throughout Josh's presentation, you can go ahead and type those into the chat or the Q&A boxes, and I'm going to hold those all until the end. But if a question pops into your head, feel free to go ahead and write it down, and we will address those at the end. So let's get started. So we have today Joshua Rodriguez-Hobbs. He is a 2018 ECF Fellow, but he is also the Episcopal Chaplain at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. So Joshua, why don't you go ahead? Take it away.
Thanks, Kirsten. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. As Kirsten said, I am the Episcopal Chaplain at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. It's a joint ministry of the Diocese of Maryland and the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So in addition to providing spiritual and sacramental care to our Episcopal patients, I also serve as the staff chaplain to 3 of our adult psychiatric units. So I'll be speaking from that experience today. I'm also an ACPE certified educator candidate, training to be an ACPE supervisor. And really one of my goals in this is to bring some of that knowledge from the medical world to the wider church. We'll be talking today about the way trauma is impacting our ministries, the way that social determinants of health are creating racial disparities with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as ways that we as faith leaders can be advocates for the people we serve and for our communities, as well as sustaining our ministries during a time of stress. So to start with, we'll be talking about trauma. And I love to introduce talking about trauma with this quote from Judith Herman. Dr. Herman is a psychiatrist who has specialized in traumatic disorders and the treatment especially of survivors of sexual and domestic abuse. And in her book, Trauma and Recovery, she writes, "Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life." So with this definition of trauma differs from what we'd see if we looked it up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is sort of a list of all psychiatric diagnoses recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. And that's used in medical care. But I think this is a helpful distinction for us who are, for the most part, not speaking as mental health professionals, to think about trauma as that which overwhelms our ordinary human adaptations to life. That means that trauma is something that renders us unable to cope with what has caused the trauma, whatever that precipitating event was. Trauma is about being overwhelmed. And you'll notice that this creates a really expansive definition of trauma. What you find traumatic may be really different from what I find traumatic based on our coping skills and coping mechanisms, our support systems, also our life events and the stressors we've received. Trauma impacts people differently based on social location and historic parts of our life story. So that what could be triggering or traumatic for one person isn't necessarily for another. So as we think about doing trauma-informed spiritual care, I think it's really important to keep this in mind, that trauma is something that we judge based on the way it affects an individual, and that it's always best to believe someone when they tell us that they're feeling traumatized or overwhelmed, that we take people where they are. Dr. Herman talks about that people who care for those who have been traumatized or are survivors of various traumas should take a position of moral solidarity with the people we serve. So we are identified with those individuals who are suffering from the effects of trauma. We're going to talk briefly about trauma reaction. I am not going to go into all of this information, but these slides will be available through ECF after the presentation, and there is a link on them to the source, Trauma-Informed Care and Behavioral Health Services, that comes from the Centers for Substance Abuse Treatment out of the National Institutes of Health. It's available online for free through the NIH. But I think it's helpful to think about what trauma does. There is also in the resource, we're not going to go into all the aspects of trauma reaction. We're not going to talk as much about the physiological reaction to trauma, just because that's out of most of our scope of practice as religious leaders, in our faith communities, as people who provide spiritual care. But I think it is important to talk about the emotional reactions to start with. And you'll notice in this slide and the next couple slides, there are two columns: the immediate emotional reaction and the delayed reaction. The immediate reactions are what we expect to see in the immediate aftermath. We're talking hours to days to maybe weeks of a traumatic event. These delayed reactions are what we expect to see months after an event. There's no precise timeline for either, but these immediate reactions are in the realm of psychological first aid. And these delayed reactions could be criteria to make a referral for someone that you know or for yourself to a mental health professional for therapy, a form of counseling, and other mental health treatment. So just starting, and I also want to point out too, when I started giving this presentation in various dioceses, we were in the beginning weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic and talking a lot about the immediate reactions. Now that we're several months in, we're in both immediate and delayed reaction territory. As individual things happen, a new diagnosis, the diagnosis of a family member, a death, someone could go back into these immediate reactions on the left, but most of us are now moving into delayed reaction territory. I've recognized some of these things in myself. So in the immediate aftermath, things that we expect to see include numbness or detachment. Often it's described as shock. I just can't take this in. At the same time, there could be increased euphoria or exhilaration that someone has survived. It hasn't happened yet. And these are all, I don't want to pathologize these immediate reactions. These are normal emotional responses that deserve compassion and care, and maybe just normalizing the emotion, that this is common to feel disoriented or out of control, to feel intense anger, sadness, or helpfulness, or just this feeling of being overwhelmed. But since where we're at, and as a country, as a world really, let's look at these delayed emotional reactions. That if you're finding now that you are more irritable or hostile than your baseline, that is definitely a potential warning sign that you might need some extra help coping. Feelings of depression, that we're moving out perhaps from that feeling of sadness to now we could be looking at perhaps a clinical depressive episode, which could be diagnosed by a mental health professional. You might see mood swings, an increased sense of anxiety, either of specific things or just a generalized anxiety in the air. You could feel a fear of trauma reoccurrence. I think some of the trauma response with COVID-19 is being repeatedly activated. So perhaps we're not moving into the trauma recurrence that we might have with a one-time event. But there's also a grief reaction, feelings of shame based on um, the here the shame may not actually be based in reality. Um, Feelings of fragility or excessive vulnerability, or perhaps just this feeling emotionally detached. All of these things are signs that our ability to cope is depressed, just like we see in that initial trauma. Um, we could be here weeks to months, and seeing where we're at can be really important. Just to keeping things in mind as we check in with ourselves, our own self-care, and with people that we care for. As we move into cognitive reactions, I think this is really important. I see a lot of these in myself these days. So in this immediate reaction, you might have difficulty concentrating. You might have racing thoughts that you can't get out of your head, a distortion of time and space. Maybe you're having short-term memory problems, or this feeling of strong identification with the victims of the trauma for those of us who are bystanders. And I'm still seeing some of these immediate cognitive reactions. My memory is not where it was in February. Um, that this is just one way that I hear pretty universally with people I talk to, one way that we're all showing a trauma response, because collectively as a society, we are all traumatized. And it's so important to keep that in mind. But as we move from these immediate reactions that are just the fact that our flight, fight, or freeze system is being constantly activated, let's look at some of these delayed reactions, which a lot of us are in right now. You might have intrusive memories or flashbacks. This current trauma may reactivate past trauma. And this is really true for most people who have had any sort of trauma in their lives. Um, Even if you've been through and worked through much of that in therapy, being re-traumatized can bring up new things to take back to work on. There could be a feeling of self-blame, especially as we look at COVID, for people who wonder or fear that they infected a loved one. You could have a preoccupation with the event. And these next few I really want to highlight, um, especially in the lives of faith community. One thing that we're seeing with a delayed trauma response is difficulty making decisions. For those of you who are lay or ordained leaders in your faith community, this is the time to postpone any major decision making that you can. The fact is, none of us are just cognitively able to make our best decisions right now. There are, of course, many decisions that can't be put off. Of course, as we move through different stages of the pandemic, I know lots of dioceses and bishops and standing committees, rectors and vestries are looking at what criteria do you need to have to begin offering in-person worship in your buildings again. Some of that can't be delayed. I know from my experience in parish ministry, problems with the physical plant never happen at a good time. And so there may just be like major physical needs with your building that have to be taken care of right now that can't be put off. And at that point, I think as people of faith, we pray, we ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance to help us make the best decision we can, because I still believe God is active in our faith communities. Um, but this is the place where it is a great idea to delay decisions that can be put off. If you're in the middle of a search for new leadership, any sort of hiring process, if you could wait a couple months, you might have a much better fit, or everyone can make better decisions. The other thing that we see with a cognitive trauma response is magical thinking. This is the idea that somehow if we do this, everything will be okay. And as I hear from people in parishes, I hear it in the parish I attend to, well, if we would just go back to worshiping in person, everything would be fine. If we could just go back to normal. And this is magical thinking because we're thinking that if we just do this, everything will magically be better. And this is one of the reasons that we have difficulty making decisions at this time. Um, Otherwise, I also want to highlight here that there could be a rise in suicidal ideation in our communities. So to be on um, the lookout for that as we are talking with fellow parishioners, with people in our community, with people that we care about. Um, this is COVID-19 is triggering so many people's existing mental health conditions and causing the emergence and diagnosis of new mental health conditions. One of the things that I do really want to highlight from my work as a psychiatric chaplain is that a lot of psychiatric facilities have actually reduced the number of beds they have to serve people. So this is something, they're doing that to increase social distancing, to decrease the chance of transmission and infection with COVID-19. These are good decisions that people are making the best decisions they can, but there are these ripple effects. And so it may be, for those of us who have positions of authority in our faith communities, it might be really important to advocate for people that we care for, to get them the help they need, especially as we see the exacerbation or new mental health needs happening. In terms of behavior reactions, we can see startled reactions, feelings of restlessness, sleep and appetite disturbances immediately after the event. We can also see some use of coping mechanisms, like increased use of alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. We're trying to self-medicate pain away, withdrawal and apathy, other avoidant behaviors. And these carry through to where we're at with a lot of the delayed behavioral reactions. And I think this is a highlight too, to talk about um, the fact that people may be doing more self-medicating than normal. So something to watch in ourselves. Have I become really dependent on that glass of wine to rewind at the end of the day, after work is done, after my son has gone to bed? Um, and just looking at that, has that one glass of wine become two? Just paying attention and monitoring this in ourselves. And I'm speaking personally that I saw this increase for myself and making a conscious decision to say, you know what? I'm starting to self-medicate. This is a time to do more therapy, and maybe for this point, I've completely cut off my alcohol consumption just because it got concerning for me. I could see that this could was in the process of becoming something that might be a problem. At the same time, you can see an increased amount of withdrawal for people who are in active addiction. And so helping those people in our communities get the support they need to manage those withdrawal symptoms. For many alcoholics, alcohol withdrawal needs to be medically managed. So helping people navigate the healthcare system. This is sort of a side effect. A lot of jurisdictions in the United States, I know it happened in Maryland, closed liquor stores at some point, which forced a lot of people into alcohol withdrawal, which was a huge public health issue we had to deal with here. So keeping these in mind and just doing that check in with people that you know are in recovery. If you're in recovery, reaching out for additional help. I know so many people, one of my units that I serve in the hospital is a dual diagnosis unit for people who have co-occurring substance use and mental health disorders. And every one of my patients is talking about how this has been the most difficult period in their sobriety. There are so many stressors going on right now. And finally, I want to talk about existential reactions. This is the place where faith really talks about, is in part of this conversation. How are we going to make meaning out of this experience we're having? In the moment, we might have been praying more. I know that's certainly been true of me. Maybe we're seeing things that either restore our sense of faith in humanity or despair about humanity. Um, we could feel that we're less able to help ourselves. We might have experienced this disruption of assumptions about how life worked. For those of us who are planning any sort of religious education or doing any sort of preaching in our faith communities, these delayed existential reactions are a great place to look at to help you do some planning about sermon topics, Christian education series, helping people deal with the questioning that they have. These questions of why me, or why did God allow it? Speaking to people who might feel more cynical, who might feel like they are feeling hopeless, or that there's a loss of purpose. At the same time, there's this huge opportunity for growth, that these periods of trauma can be a time to deepen our relationship with God or our higher power, leading to renewed faith, working on reestablishing our priorities to live better and more congruently with our values. And it might mean redefining questions of meaning and importance. So those of us who have any position of leadership in our faith communities can be huge resources with this. While we think about the trauma piece, I also want to highlight the way that there are racial disparities with COVID-19, which is just, I think, compounding the situation we see with the people, so many people all across America going out to the streets to protest police brutality, to advocate for the fact that Black lives do matter, and that racism is a sin. We're also seeing this in healthcare. And this is a place where people of faith, that we can also do advocacy. You can't really see this. This is a screenshot of a chart that the Kaiser Family Foundation has that tracks confirmed cases and death in every state in the United States by race and ethnicity. Now, there's a couple states that don't report. But the fact is that African American and Latinx communities are disproportionately infected by COVID-19. This isn't because that there is something in these communities that inherently makes them more susceptible to COVID-19. The fact is that there are existing disparities in healthcare, in housing, employment, and in education that are causing this disproportionate distribution of the outcome. The more marginalized people are, the worse health outcomes they have in the United States. In the city of Baltimore, depending on your zip code, if you look between the city and county, there is a gap of 20 years in average life expectancy from some of our poorest neighborhoods to our richest neighborhoods. And that the majority of states that are providing information on deaths, on infections and death by race or ethnicity, African Americans have died from COVID-19 at a rate higher than their proportion of the population. This is because of the way that bias and racism, conscious and unconscious, affect health outcomes. And in Maryland, the African Americans make up 29.3% of the population and 41.5% of COVID-19 deaths. At my hospital, on any given day, about 30% of our COVID-19 cases in ICUs have been people with limited English proficiency. This is a healthcare term for people who need interpretation services. The vast majority of our patients with limited English proficiency right now speak Spanish as their primary or only language. They're members of the Latinx community. They are in areas of town because of poverty that have substandard housing, have less access to resources, houses are closer together. They are often working jobs that were deemed essential, which often pay a lot less money than non-essential jobs where we've been able to work from home. So there's just been so much more contact. There's a case from Twitter that I want to hold up from a ED physician Esther Chu, that she posted, this true story. And she writes, 2 patients came into the ER one night, both brought in by ambulances, both short of breath, both with severe asthma. The white man got a nebulizer breathing treatment in the ambulance. The black man did not, citing COVID rules against using nebulizer treatments. During COVID, we are avoiding nebulizer treatments as they're aerosolizing. That means that they can put out more infected particles into the air. The black man got treatment consistent with existing policy. It would be easy to justify. Policy was just followed there. But as Dr. Chu points out, why did the white man receive a policy sidestep? Do you see the privilege at every decision? This is one other place for us as people of faith to insist that Black Lives Matter, to use the moral standing that we often have in our communities, that moral persuasion, to advocate for the just and equitable treatment of people receiving medical care. And that could mean, as best you can, I know it has been very difficult for many clergy and lay leaders to be doing hospital visits right now. I know in my hospital, we are still limiting visitors to control infection, as a form of infection control. But be in contact, ask what people need, be an advocate. Come in if you are ordained, if you're making a hospital visit, wear your collar to be visible. It helps you do that advocacy. Reach out to the chaplains in hospitals where members of your faith community are so that we can be part of this advocacy too. But this is a place we are not seeing the pain that the pandemic is causing spread equally in our society. And it is exacerbating these existing fault lines, which fall right along racial and ethnic boundaries. And I want to lift this up, especially right now. So we're going to move a little quickly because I realized this is something I'm passionate about. We are moving, we spent a lot of time on that material because I think it's important. But I want to move into thinking about some theological answers that we as people of faith can offer. And I've really been influenced in my life and ministry, but especially right now, by the theology of Paul Tillich. Tillich was a German Lutheran minister and theologian. He served as an army chaplain in the German army during World War I. He experienced a nervous breakdown and during the war, and today would certainly have been diagnosed with PTSD. Tillich fled the Nazis and taught in America at a variety of different seminaries, Union Theological Seminary, Harvard Divinity School, and University of Chicago Divinity School, and really functioned as a public intellectual in the middle of the last century. But I love this quote from his book, The Courage to Be. Tillich writes, "The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. So many of our assumptions about God have been disrupted. But this is an opportunity to have a truer and deeper understanding of God, for us to come to know God in real ways and in new ways." One place that Tillich pointed to help with this is art. And this is a painting by the German Renaissance painter Matthias Grunewald. It is a detail of the Eisenheim altarpiece. This is the outside of the altarpiece depicting the crucifixion. And what I love about this painting is its context. Grunewald painted it to hang in the chapel of a German monastery that specialized in treating victims of the bubonic plague. And it's probably one of the most grotesque depictions of the crucifixion I've ever seen. You can see how Jesus's body is distorted and distended in inhuman ways. Um, but I love, as you look at these close-up images, you can see that Grunewald does something that, as far as I'm aware of, I don't know has been ever done in art before, because he depicts Jesus as sick. In Grunewald's painting, the sort of green pallor that Jesus has, these sores that cover his body, the way that we see this, his arms, his hands and his arms and feet are twisted, are all ways that people suffered from the bubonic plague. So as these monks who cared for plague victims, and plague victims went to worship God in this chapel, they saw God on in the altar reflecting their trauma. The part of what it meant to know Jesus Christ was that to know that my experience of trauma was known. And I think this is a powerful image to me as I attempt to minister during this global pandemic, to understand that something about the sufferings that we see happening all around us is reflected in the life of God. Because Jesus still bears the marks of crucifixion after his resurrection. This is Caravaggio's painting, The Incredulity of St. Thomas. I'm going to be honest, I love the Eisenheim altarpiece. It speaks to me. The Incredulity of St. Thomas makes me sick to my stomach. There is something about this painting every time I see it. It's so deeply unsettling. I think because it's so intimate, the way that Caravaggio depicts Jesus physically placing Thomas's hand in his wound. But I think there is something so important here about the way that Jesus still bears scars and invites people into his woundedness. As we, as traumatized individuals, attempt to minister to other traumatized individuals right now, we were worshiping and proclaiming the truth of a God who experienced trauma, who was traumatized, and who even after his resurrection still bore the signs of his trauma. Tillich writes elsewhere, doubt is overcome not by repression, but by courage. Courage does not deny that there is doubt, but it takes the doubt into itself as an expression of its own finitude and affirms the content of an ultimate concern. Courage does not need the safety of an unquestionable conviction. It includes the risk without which no creative life is possible. And this is a time, I think, to look courageously at our own woundedness, to hold our faith and doubt side by side, and to discern as a community of faith, as a church, where and how is God moving right now? I'd like to talk about what this post-traumatic ministry could look like. For the sake of time, we're going to skip this slide, but I'd like to point us to doing some reflection on our own about the story of doubting Thomas in the 20th chapter of John, and thinking about the way that Jesus responds to his disciples. And as I think about the idea of post-traumatic ministry, I'm really influenced by the Reverend David Peters, who is also an ECF fellow, a veteran Army chaplain. He's a church planner in the Diocese of Texas. I include his book, Post-Traumatic Ministry, as a resource that I commend everyone to read. It's also a really great introduction to Tillich if you don't want to just jump right in to Tillich's really dense prose. David does this great job of breaking Tillich down. But the first thing that Jesus does when he appears to his disciples is he says, "Peace be with you." So as people of faith, how is God calling us to speak words of peace to our communities. What is the word of peace that you need to hear right now? And how can you proclaim it? Second, I think this is a time for us to own our own woundedness. I think sometimes there's a lot of talk about how religious leaders should present a brave faith, maybe not brave face, maybe not own our doubt, our fear. And I think this is the opposite time to do that. What Jesus does in the story from John's Gospel, and that painting from Caravaggio, is he shows his wounds. He lifts them up to the disciples. Henry Nouwen, in his book, The Wounded Healer, has that great quote that open wounds stink and do not heal. Of course, we don't want to go out and bleed on the people that we're trying to serve, because that reverses the dynamic of care. And so that we are coming from a position of authority and power as leaders, and now asking those we serve to serve us and take care of us instead of taking care of them. But being able, after we've done some processing, after we've experienced a degree of healing, to talk about our own woundedness. We serve a risen Christ who still has wounds. And I think this is a place for us to speak about our own fear, our own doubt, and how we experience God's presence even in the midst of it. This image to the right I want to lift up, this is a Japanese art form called kintsugi, which is a metaphor I often have started using in my ministry. Kintsugi literally means golden joints, and broken pieces of pottery are repaired with gold lacquer so that the break becomes visible. And using the Japanese Zen Buddhist concept of wabi-sabi, which means finding beauty in imperfection, these broken and repaired pieces of pottery are seen as more beautiful and more valuable than they were before they were broken. So as we are broken by life and we experience the way that God and God's people help put us back together, this can become a source of strength and beauty and calling for ministry. I think that's so important to lift up right now, to find ways to appropriately share our wounds with the people we serve. That helps to normalize their wounds. And I think there's something faithful about that. Third, love people into relationship. This is not the time to try and convince people that we're right and they're wrong as we think about the life of the parish. We are not able to have that cognitive debate that we were able to, if we were able to months ago. And as people experience trauma, they act out. I see this in myself. I see this in other people. And this is a time to extend that love and grace. Because Jesus doesn't come to Thomas and say, "Where the hell were you?" He doesn't shame Thomas for not believing in the resurrection. But he comes to Thomas and loves him and restores him to relationship. This is a time to, as best we can, offer grace. That doesn't mean that we give people a free pass in our communities to act however they want to, because love can often mean calling people to account and to calling people to be responsible for their actions. But this is a time to lead from love. And finally, this is a time for us to listen, to understand, not respond. So many times I can be in my head and thinking about, this is exactly what I need to say to this person. But that's a failure to listen on my part. And so going in to listen, just to be present and listen. And finally, I think this is an opportunity for the church to recover the Ars Moriendi, the acts of dying. Especially in the medieval ages, the church writ large used to prepare the faithful for what they called holy dying, the art of dying. And now we sort of don't talk about death in our churches. We can contribute to the denial of death. And the people, at least in America, who are guiding the discussion about the Ars Moriendi, in our modern age are all physicians. And I think the world of physicians, I work with great physicians, but there's this place for us to speak from a place of faith that is being missed. If you haven't read Atul Gawande's book, Being Immortal, it's excellent. I recommend it. But this is the place where I send people now to talk about how to think about death and dying. Where in the past, the church was constantly teaching about this. So this is a moment for the church to reclaim that, to speak to the reality of death, to speak to what it could mean to die well, to face death with faith, to believe in resurrection, rather than contributing to our death-denying culture. I think this is especially true right now as we are facing this pandemic, which means that so many people are dying alone. People aren't able to be with their family, with their faith communities, and it's causing tremendous suffering. So this is a time when we as people of faith are going to have to respond pastorally to this. The great example in the Anglican tradition is Jeremy Taylor. I talked too long, so I'm not going to read this long quote. But Jeremy Taylor wrote a book, The Rule and Acts of Holy Dying, in the middle of the English Civil War about this. And he just says, you can't, at the beginning of the book, you can't start to learn about what it means to die when you are dying, that we prepare for death by the way we live our lives. And I think this is a place that, instead of being morbid, could be deeply hopeful, and is speaking to a place where there is so much need right now in our culture, as we face something that the world has not seen on this scale in over 100 years. So finally, at the last stage of the slide are several resources that could be helpful for you to think about these things. I have Judith Herman's book. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler wrote a book on grief and grieving. It's much better than On Death and Dying. So if you haven't read either book, just read this book. It's an update of On Death and Dying. David Peters has his book, Post-Traumatic God. And I'll also lift up Henry Nouwen's The Wounded Healer and Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be, which is probably his most accessible and best known book. So we are going to move into a time of questions. I know, Kirsten, you've been collecting those.
Indeed, I have. All right, so guys, if you have any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat or Q&A boxes. Either one, watching both. Josh, that was so great. Thank you so much.
I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to present this to a wider audience, to partner with ECF.
Yeah, and we're so happy to have you. It's that you mentioned David Peters. We had you too. He's 2017 fellow, and you came in the next year. And also in 2017, we had Renee McKenzie Hayward, and the three of you in talking about trauma and what trauma ministry means and how it can be, or how it is helping shape us and how it can shepherd these communities along, was really eye-opening to me. And I know a lot of our staff, at least, who are.
Yeah, I can say if anyone is only going to read one of those resources, read David Peters' book, Post-Traumatic God. He is specifically focusing on his experiences as a veteran, as someone who has PTSD from his experiences in conflict, in combat, which are certainly different from other forms of PTSD and unique, but so much of what he writes is applicable to thinking about trauma and people with PTSD generally. And he does this great job of bringing together theological, psychological threads, tying them together, and with practical ways to address them in our ministries, in our faith communities. So it's often a really easy way to adapt it, to talking about other forms of trauma.
Yeah, and what I do think was interesting with the three of you fellows specifically is that you were all talking about different trauma, but how at its base, we come at it from the same point of view.
Right. so much of it, trauma is trauma, and there can be little different nuances to it based on what the trigger was, what the precipitating event was. But after that, people tend to respond really similarly. PTSD symptoms are PTSD symptoms. I do want to point out, I'm speaking about my experience and my expertise as a healthcare chaplain, as someone who is working with doctors, nurses, and other clinicians. But just lifting this up, so much of that information about trauma is widely applicable. So even though I, as a Euro-American, can't speak authoritatively on the experiences, especially that African American men and women have and are having and are possibly having re-triggering right now from the racism in our society. So much of the trauma response guidelines can be applied to the pastoral care after the fact too. And again, racism isn't just something that we see in the form of police brutality. It is alive and well in our healthcare system and the care that people receive. There's lots of studies that one of the things that complicates COVID treatments is the way that reports of symptoms and pain especially are not believed by medical personnel when they come from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. That there is just this bias, and especially African Americans and Indigenous people are so much more likely to be labeled as drug seeking in healthcare environments. And so this is a place for real advocacy for those of us who, when you are visiting a member of your faith community in the hospital, to be speaking up and advocating for them with the medical staff. Especially, not to say that this is something that only priests and deacons can do. Lay people can be effective advocates too, especially if you have specialized medical training. But the truth is, doctors and nurses respond to a clerical caller. And so if you're wearing that on your pastoral visit and seeing something, it is this great way to quickly establish your authority and to have your voice listened to.
Yeah, great advice. Do you have any other parting advice for folks who are here or who will be listening later, who are lay leaders, who may not have that, or who don't have that collar of first authority, of how to get started on being effective advocates?
I think the best you can do is become as informed as you can. I know at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, we have it's called the Medical Religious Partners Program. If you Google that, and I can provide the link to you too, Kirsten, to share that with ECF. We have a whole set of curriculum for faith communities to use to learn how to address public health needs. There's a book that you can use as a study topic that was written by 2 doctors and a psychologist working in the Johns Hopkins healthcare system about the ways that we partner with faith communities. So the fact that if you can speak to and demonstrate your knowledge, that often helps. Sometimes if you're a parish nurse, that's a position to speak from. So if you can work with your parish, your faith community, to get you some official looking business cards, if you pull out a parish nurse business card and are talking that medical language, that's a great way to also establish authority. Especially if you are, right now, this is all hard because every hospital has these visitor restrictions. But as we return to and establish a new normal, once we are able to visit people again, the fact that you show up, if there is a consistent presence in medical facilities, that gets noticed. So many times, especially if a person is not able to be an effective advocate for themselves, if you can come in and advocate for them, to say, hey, I'm noticing this. If their family is not able to be physically present, have communication from the faith community to the family who are going to be surrogate healthcare decision makers. Lead a workshop in your church around the ways that people can do advanced healthcare planning and designate healthcare decision makers. The exact terminology differs state to state. This could be a medical power of attorney, healthcare decision maker, designated proxy. There's lots of different language. But as a layperson, you can just work with the leadership of your faith community to offer a workshop on this. Have someone come in. I know at Hopkins, we have a program that we will go to your parish and answer questions, talk about the law in Maryland. I've done that in a lot of faith communities, Episcopal and otherwise, in Baltimore, and I'm always happy to do it. So thinking about these things, thinking about how you can be an advocate for the people that you love and care for, and for people, having who are at a very long distance from their family or don't, or estranged from their family isn't supportive for whatever reason, or just have no surviving close family, taking that place as your faith community as a family. I think when we're at our best, we do that and take care of people. And that these healthcare decision makers don't have to be biologically related or related by marriage. They can be any other adult that a person wants to designate. So if you have that authority as a layperson, you actually come in the room with more authority than a priest would by putting on the collar, because you are now the designated healthcare decision maker. You're the person the team has to consult with before they do everything. So finding those ways, advocating, helping people put their wishes in writing, making that available for those who have healthcare training, are interested in important and needed ministry. Look at establishing a parish nursing program. Become active as a Eucharistic minister, especially if you're visiting people in long-term care facilities. The fact that you're present there is going to give you some of that moral authority to advocate on behalf of patients with staff.
Really great advice, Josh. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, so no questions came in, so I think that is our time today. So thank you again, Josh, for sharing all of this. For folks who are here, we are going to make all of these slides and any resources that were mentioned throughout the presentation available to you. You'll be getting an email from me with both the recording of this and any of the related resources. So thank you once again, Josh.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kirsten. I want to say a big thank you to ECF, both for supporting the ministry I'm doing at Johns Hopkins through the Fellowship Partners Program, and also for this opportunity. ECF has done a great job of collecting resources around COVID-19, and it is this is exactly the type of partnership that we hope to have with local faith communities at Hopkins. And healthcare is best when people of faith and communities of faith can partner with healthcare institutions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again, and thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you soon.